topic for the 5-week series we've been doing for the Greener Backyard and Environmental Stewardship Workshop series. So thank you everybody who's been coming out for this. This has been a lot of fun. We're in the process of planning another workshop series, so once we create some advertisements and stuff, we'll let you guys know. So this week's topic is on microplastics in the environment. So this is a topic I don't think a lot of people really know too much about, but this is something that there's been a really big push for understanding in the past few decades, and especially now, this is becoming something more and more popular to learn about and study in science. So firstly, what is plastic? So plastics, I'm sure everybody's familiar with these household objects, spray bottles, whatever your laundry detergent comes in, plastic bottles that our food comes in, it's all made out of this plastic. And so what plastic is a synthetic or semi-synthetic organic polymer. And what that means is that it's composed of organic molecules, so these are molecules that can contain carbon, and polymers are just chains or compounded organic molecules. So organic polymer, it's a long chain of those organic carbon-containing molecules. And so the starting material for plastic is actually, for the most part, crude oil. And it comes from a lot of not renewable resources. So oil, coal, gas, and cellulose is plant-derived. So what we want to take away from this is that plastic is always some sort of synthetic polymer. Always, it's either fully synthetic or completely synthetic, and therefore that makes it a little bit complicated to find ways to break it down and to reuse these things. And then microplastics. So this is really interesting because there's two kind of ways to think about microplastics. Either they're starting materials to build other plastics, or they're the product of some sort of breakdown of plastics. So when we think about beads and nurdles, we're thinking about the starting materials for other plastic products. And when we think about fragments, fibers, and foams, we're generally thinking about breakdown. However, fibers such as nylon can be used to make other synthetic products like our shirts and such. And when we think microplastic, we're thinking about 5 millimeters and less. But a lot of microplastics that get talked about are actually called mesoplastics, so they're in the range of 5 to 25 millimeters size. And to take a closer look at microplastics, we'll look at these pellets. So these are things like beads and nurdles. So nurdles are like these large, well, kind of large. They're very distinct and they're usually colored, and these are foundational for the production of other plastics. So you might get a bunch of nurdles and then that gets melted down and shaped into a bottle, for example. And they can be in a lot of different shapes and sizes and colors. So they can be spherical, they can be rectangular, they can be cylindrical. Some are more spherical, like actual beads, and some are more kind of flat and squished like a disc. We have fragments, so basically it kind of looks like you took plastic and kind of smashed it with a hammer and it created a bunch of irregular shaped fragments. Fibers, so things like nylon, fishing line, these are all types of fibers. They're thin, very, very thin, and they can be of different lengths. And foam, for the most part, we're talking about polystyrene. So things like styrofoam cups that they just kind of fall apart over time. And polystyrene doesn't actually degrade, it's just kind of getting smaller. And the same goes for a lot of plastic. It's not really degrading as much as it is just getting smaller. And then films can be like stickers, like plastic stickers and things like that. And so to put a name to those two ways of thinking about microplastics, either they're the the starting material for other plastic products, or they're the result of some sort of breakdown, that results in two different categories. The primary microplastics, so those are the ones that are the industrial manufactured microbeads, and those are the nurdles, right? They can even be those beads you find in face scrubs, which I'm pretty sure those are banned now. You can't really use them. But those are primary. They were made, they're either going straight into a product or they're being shaped into another product. Secondary, they're the result of maybe a plastic bottle breaking down from weathering and degradation of other larger plastic products. So taking a look at these two pictures, we want to think which is primary and which is secondary. And so when you think primary, the way I kind of think of it is that those beads, they look more put together. They look like they're supposed to look that way, whereas a secondary microplastic looks like something happened to it. So the secondary would be on the left, primary would be on the right. So on the right, that's an example of a cylindrical primary microplastic. And then here on the left, we have fragmented secondary microplastics. And so just for a second, I just want to point out that plastic is a problem overall because it just has such a long life, and that makes it good in a lot of ways, right? We need things that have a long lifespan, that are durable and are flexible, and plastic was the solution for that when it was first being produced. It was cost effective, it was durable, you could put a lot of different things in it and ship it all over the place. And unfortunately, what ended up happening was we created so much plastic that we didn't really know what to do with it. And even now, we can't even recycle all of the plastic that we do produce. And a lot of it is just very, very long-lived. So as you can see here, things break down on the range, for the most part, of hundreds of years for plastic. So straws, 200 years, your toothbrush, 500 years. These are timescales that are kind of hard to imagine, right? You go to place and you get a drink and you put a straw in that cup, and you're done using that straw in an hour, and then it takes 200 years to degrade. And so that's kind of where I want people to kind of pay attention to, is the lifespan of things and how it's hard to comprehend that, and it's hard to manage that. It's hard to manage a product that takes so long to degrade. And so where are they found? The short answer is everywhere. Plastic is found everywhere, and microplastics are found everywhere. We can find them in places like the ocean. We can find them in our beaches, estuaries, lakes. They're flying around the air. They're in our rivers, and they're also in Arctic ice. So there's not a surface of the earth that microplastics have not found their way into. And that's significant, right? Because it shows us that microplastics are moving throughout the planet. All of those different systems of the planet are all connected. Air, water, right? They're all connected, and it's helping microplastics spread, and also playing a role in their degradation and their breakdown. So when we think about how common are they, like when are you going to come into contact with microplastics? Well, there's a few things that are going to play a role in that. Firstly, how close are you to some sort of urbanization or industry? Because if you're really close to maybe a plastic producing factory, well, you're going to be in closer proximity to those nurdles and those concentrations of plastic. Whereas maybe if you're somewhere, I don't know, in a mountain in Alaska or something, you might be a little bit more distant from microplastics. So when we think about our coastal regions, we can find microplastics throughout the water column. So from the surface waters all the way down to the bottom. And more significantly, we find that those microplastics are being buried and accumulating in those sediments at the bottom of the ocean. And they're also found throughout the food web. So within those marine organisms, we find microplastics. And so this term you'll see a lot with microplastics is it's a ubiquitous pollutant, meaning it is found throughout the ocean. It's found everywhere. And the same goes for inland regions. We find microplastics in the soils, we find them in our surface waters of our lakes, streams, and rivers, and as well as in their sediments. So again, this is a ubiquitous pollutant that we see throughout both our coastal and inland regions. So here's an example of a study that I thought was pretty cool. So this study looked at 37 different beaches at 35 different national parks. So basically they went out and they took samples, and then they looked, well, what kind of microplastics and how much are we finding at these different national park beaches. And so I want to point out here that not all of the beaches are coastal, right? Microplastics are not limited to coastal regions. They're also inland. And so we see, we take into account the Great Lakes areas and even islands and such, right? And what they found was that the highest concentrations of microplastics were actually occurring in the Great Lakes area and on some Pacific islands. And so the main type of microplastic they were finding was microfiber, meaning, and these are usually derived from clothing, or they can be the byproduct of the breakdown of other larger plastic products. So I think this was really significant, at least for me and my perception of this, because you tend to think microplastics, ocean, all the plastic ends up in the ocean, but we have to always think on a watershed level too. How do things get to the ocean? And a lot of the time they're getting there from our streams and rivers, which are then connecting to the ocean. So the Great Lakes area, for example, that's a very populated area. There's a lot of different industries there. And so it's kind of not surprising that we find a lot of microplastics there. And in terms of New Jersey, there's not actually a lot of specific studies that are looking at microplastics in New Jersey, at least that are published yet. So I know there's a lot in the works with this. But there was a paper put out in 2017, and they looked at different microplastics in the Raritan and Passaic rivers, and they sampled at two different kind of conditions. So dry conditions, so when the water is kind of low, and a wet condition when the water is a bit more high, and like a wet season. And what they found was that there's microplastics all over the place, basically. And the microplastic density was higher in the Passaic River than in the Raritan River. And so these are really the only two rivers we've really looked kind of closely at. And here the most common type they found was a fragmented microplastic. So that's a secondary microplastic. And then they also wanted to look at the biological effects of these microplastics. And so one thing that happens to microplastics once they're in the environment is that pollutants, they're called POPs, persistent organic pollutants, they actually will attach to the surface of those microplastics and mobilize that pollutant throughout the water or wherever it's at. So what they did in this study was they treated the microplastics with an organic pollutant, and then they exposed zebrafish embryos to them. And what they saw were morphological changes. So essentially, this study was just giving an example of how the persistent organic pollutants that can be mobilized and transported on these microplastics can cause biological issues and deformities in embryos. And so that's kind of a significant thing to realize, is that maybe the plastics aren't causing the biggest problem once in an organism. They might pass through, or maybe they'll accumulate. There's still a lot to learn here, but they are transporting those persistent organic pollutants, which is something significant to consider. And so when we think about the transport of these microplastics, so it's getting all over the place in a lot of different ways, right? All of these systems are connected. So when we have microplastics mobilized in the air, well, they're flying from one place to another, but they're also depositing as they're traveling. This is called atmospheric deposition. So what happens is those microplastics are going to come in contact with the ground, and then they might get buried in the ground, or they might then get picked up and washed off in stormwater runoff, or maybe the atmospheric deposition will happen over the ocean or another body of water, and then it'll get into the water that way. Also influencing the movement is wind and tides, right? Anytime you have some sort of movement and a particle that's very small, these things are getting moved all over the place. And the same holds true for erosion and runoff. When these plastics are in the environment, they're very easily picked up and transported from one place to another. Some are going to get degraded as they move along that path. Some are going to get buried and deposited. And of course, as we were saying before, some of them are going to get ingested in like the food web, right? And then those microplastics can get passed through different organisms over time. And sometimes, like I was saying before, they will get deposited in deep ocean sediments. So all of these things are really complicated, right? There's no one way we can just say this is one pollutant and this is the problem. It's so much more than that. It's such a global kind of issue that we're facing because everything on the planet is connected. All of the water is moving, the tides are pushing plastics in different ways. We have different currents and wind patterns. And so one pollutant that you make up here in New Jersey can very easily be transported, you know, into the ocean and elsewhere on the planet. So just to give a little bit more of a background on the movement of microplastics, right? We want to think about the things we do. How do we get those plastics in the environment in the first place? So one way microfibers end up in the environment is from washing our clothes. Every time you put your clothing that's made from synthetic fibers, such as nylon, into the washing machine, those fibers come loose, and that ends up going into your wastewater. And so that wastewater, if you're on a municipal water connection, it's going to go to that treatment plant. Those treatment plants are not designed to capture microplastics, and so they just get discharged with the water. Another way that microplastics get into our water is from those face washes, like those microbead face washes. I know, like, I had one a couple years ago that was even kind of old. And when I first learned about microplastics, I stopped buying stuff like that. But, you know, you could have one of those face washes lying around, and if you use it, those microbeads, they wash your face for, you know, those couple minutes, and then they're down the drain and into your water connection. And if you have you know, a sewer system, they can enter the environment that way as well. And of course, they're coming from an industry. So places that are producing these plastic nurdles, or places that are bottling things, plastic waste comes from there. And even when we think about modifying plastic products, so maybe you have a plastic container that has to get cut. When you cut that plastic container to reshape it or repurpose it, it's producing microplastics in the process, right? You're taking that larger plastic, you're disturbing it, and therefore you're breaking it into smaller pieces that are very easily mobilized through the very different you know, methods of transport. And so once they do get transported, a lot of it's going to end up in water sources. And so here's kind of a visual representation of microplastics and how they can come in contact with a persistent organic pollutant. So as they travel through the water, they might come in contact. Maybe it's a polluted body of water. That persistent organic pollutant will attach to the surface of that bead or that microplastic, and it can very easily get taken up by a fish, or it can get taken up by a filter feeding organism. And in a non-aquatic sense, microplastics that are you know, 5 millimeters, some of them are a little bigger, those are the ones that are most commonly picked up and ingested by birds. So this is a really big problem that we're kind of facing here. And what happens with a lot of plastic pollution is that it can, if enough of it is ingested, is birds, for example, will feel full if they've ingested enough plastic. There's, you know, material in there taking up space, and then they'll feel full, or they won't have room for their food. And what happens is that they might die from something like starvation because the microplastic isn't moving through them and it isn't being excreted. The same holds true for whales. Many times beached whales, they cut open the stomachs and they're just absolutely full of plastic pollution. And that's not just microplastics, that's also those big plastics that are being ingested. And again, those animals feel full from that and they end up dying from starvation. And this is also directly connected to environmental justice. So a lot of the things that happen in the environment are disproportionately affecting people of color. And this is a problem that is that we're becoming more and more aware of, and there's a bigger push to make people aware of this. So for example, if we look at this map here on the left, we'll see kind of like this red and yellow and orange, and this is where there's a really high risk for people to get cancer because of air pollution. And if we look here on the right, a lot of the times what happens is wherever there's a big risk for from an environmental toxin, there's also a correlation with the density of people of color. So Newark is an example of one of these areas in New Jersey where we have a really big environmental justice problem, where a lot of industry, oftentimes plastic producing industry, or industries that burn plastics or other types of garbage, they're located in areas that are dominantly inhabited by people of color. And so they're at a disproportionate they're being disproportionately affected by the consequences of that. And so a lot of times you'll hear that plastic pollution is an environmental justice issue because other things that also happen is that plastics will get shipped, for example, to China to sell them, and then they'll recycle them, but sometimes they don't accept those plastics anymore. And those plastics get displaced, and they're oftentimes getting displaced into areas that are more poverty-stricken or they're more vulnerable communities. So when we think about microplastics and we think about plastic pollution and overall environmental pollution, we want to keep in mind that this is an environmental justice issue. So we see here in other areas, Philadelphia, the correlation is very clear. Allentown. So it's just something to keep in mind and to be aware of, and something that these communities oftentimes need help with to voice their concerns and make other people and businesses aware of the disproportionate amount of suffering they're going through. And some other statistics to bring up. I think these are just kind of, those kinds of statistics you read and you're like, oh, really? So one of them is that more than 8 million tons of plastic end up in the ocean each year. So obviously, since plastic is a product of crude oil, the oil industry is profiting off of this. So, every year the oil industry is profiting $600 billion off of plastic production. This was really surprising to me when I read this. So a study had found that the average person consumes about a credit card worth of microplastics every week. And that's because, like I said, microplastics get passed throughout the food web. And so people are top predators. And so we tend to get the biomagnification effect of as microplastics are passed up through the food web, the concentration is getting higher, and then we're consuming that. And this is a pretty kind of sad statistic, is only 9% of plastic in the US actually gets recycled. New Jersey actually has a way better rate for this. So plastic in New Jersey, a lot more of it does get recycled here in New Jersey, but overall, we're not doing as good as we could be doing with plastic recycling. And so that brings me to this section where we're going to talk about community science. And so this is how people can get involved with trying to understand microplastic pollution and be a part of how we accumulate data and how that data influences perhaps policy or different studies and research. So I'll talk about two different methods or two different projects you could get involved in. You could do one or you could do both, or maybe it's not for you. So we'll talk about the Big Microplastic Survey, and then we'll also talk about the Plastic Wave Project. And so for each of these, I'll talk about sampling procedure and then how you would analyze a sample and submit your data. So the Big Microplastic Survey, that started off as a very small project in the UK at the University of Portsmouth, and it ended up being a global project where a lot of people from all over the world were submitting data. And so now they have their own database where people submit their microplastic data. And one thing I really like about this project is that the protocol is really straightforward and it's really easy to do. The other one is a little bit more complicated, but there's some other pros to it as well. So supplies needed. So one thing about community science projects is it's the aim is to keep it kind of inexpensive and accessible to people. So a lot of times the supplies you need can be substituted with other things. And a lot of the supplies you might need might be things you already have in your house. So for this procedure, what you would need is 4 meters of rope, and that's to make 1 square meter. So would be 1 meter on each side. For tent pegs, you could just as easily use something like a stick, a spoon, 2 buckets, a kitchen sieve. So they want you to have one with a mesh size of about 1 millimeter. And then you'll need a 10 centimeter square template. So you can make this 10 square centimeter template out of a lot of different things. You can make it out of sticks, you can make it out of spare wood, you can cut it out of cardboard, anything like that. And then you'll also just need 1 container or jar every time you go out and you sample. So the first thing to do would actually be to go up and sign up for this project. So you could go to microplasticsurvey.org/register, and then they have a registration form that you could fill out. And this is really important because once you register, you'll get a code, and you need that code in order to submit your data. So then you'll gather your supplies. Maybe you need to make your 10 centimeter cutout, gather rope, or you can use a meter stick. Gather all of those supplies and then pick a place in your area that you want to go sample. So I've been out sampling, actually. I went to the Seaside Heights area to go sample, but people do this all over the state. So you can just pick a location, and then you just want to make sure that you're going at a time where you can not only be safe, but you want to go out at a time when low tide is occurring. And the reason you want to do that is because that's going to show you where the high tide line is, and that's important for the surveying protocol. So you don't have to go out exactly at low tide, but you want to go out as the tide is at least going down. So you're going to fill up a bucket of water about halfway or so when you get there, and you're going to use this bucket throughout your sampling procedure. And you're going to set up on an area of beach. So you need about a 25-meter stretch of beach in order to do this, and you're going to do it at what's called the rack line. So this is kind of like the high tide line. And you'll notice the rack line based on the accumulation of usually seaweed and debris and such on the beach. So you would sample in the rack line for this procedure. And you'd sample within a 25-meter stretch. So one thing within the protocol of this, if you go ahead and you read the handbook for this, they do want you to stick to the protocol pretty tightly, meaning they want you to stick with those 1 square meter squares. They want you to stick with the 25-meter stretch of beach. And the reason they want you to do that is to make sure the data is comparable from place to place throughout the world. And you're also going to want to record the coordinates of the location you're at. And that just gets submitted with your data, so they know where you got your samples from. So basically, if we look at this image, this explains how you do the sampling procedure. So you'll find your rack line and you'll put out your 1 square meter. So if you have rope, you would just put a stick with your rope, and then you would level it out in those 4 corners. Doesn't really matter where you put the stakes or whatever, because you'll have the 4 meters of rope, and it doesn't really matter if it's skew because the area is going to stay the same. And then once you have that, you're going to take 5 subsamples, and your subsamples are going to be 10 square meters, right? So if you have a cutout, maybe you had like a cardboard thing and you cut out a 10 centimeter square, you would put that down on the beach, and you would scoop out about the first inch of sand in that 10 square centimeter area, and then you'd put that in your bucket. So remember, your bucket has water, so you're putting sand from 5 different random locations, each 10 square centimeters, into your bucket, and then you're going to stir it up. And what happens when you stir up that sand is the microplastics are going to kind of come to the surface of that water, and then you're going to drain out that water and capture the microplastics in your kitchen sifter. And so you're going to repeat this, sorry, I didn't mean to change that. You're going to repeat this multiple times over your 25-meter stretch. So after you finish your first location, you're going to move 5 meters away, and then you're going to set up a 1 square meter square again and take 5 10 square centimeter samples again. And you're just going to put it in your bucket, mix it up, strain it, capture your microplastics. And then you just do that 5 times. So you're taking a total of 25 subsamples from 5 square meter quadrants. So basically what happens is you end up collecting microplastics from each one of those 5 square meter quadrants. If you don't find any microplastics, which can happen, you still report that. You still want to report places where you're not finding microplastics. But what you'll do is you'll take those microplastics at the end of your sampling procedure, and you'll put them inside of a jar or a container, and then you'll take it home and you'll analyze it at home. Or if you want, you could, I guess, do it at the beach. And when you go home and you're looking at the microplastics, they want you to separate it in a very specific way. So they want you to separate it by type and by color. So they have 3 broad categories that you can place your microplastics into. You'll have your microplastics. So these are your nurdles and your beads. So here's an example of some nurdles. So you'll see that they're different colors. They're small, they're round. So you'll have those, and then you're going to separate them by color. So what you would do here is you would put yellows in one pile, you put green in another, and you put these like clear ones in another pile. And you would count them, and you would report the number of those microplastics. So for example, here you would say, oh, I have 3 yellow primary microplastics, and they're nurdles. Then you're going to separate out the secondary microplastics. So these are things like foam from styrofoam cups and fragments. Those are your secondary microplastics. And then you'll have your mesoplastics, which again, still part of the microplastic survey, but these are just a bit bigger. Here it's important that you note they don't want anything bigger than 25 millimeters. So that's about 1 inch in diameter or so. So you want to keep things within that range, and that might be something like a bottle cap or like a toothpaste cap, for example. And you'd put that in a different pile. You'd say, oh, I got like 3 blue bottle caps, for example. And then you would submit your data. So they have 2 different forms. They have a form, it's many pages, and it's got something like this. So here's an example of one of the categories. You have the mesoplastics, and you'll record the number of pieces and the color. So again, using the sample of like 3 blue bottle caps, the bottle cap would put it in the mesoplastic category. It would be blue, and you would record the number 3. And you could just print this out from their online website, and you can have it next to you when you're doing your sample analysis, so you can keep track of whatever you're doing. Another thing is, once you've separated everything into the piles and the types, you want to take a picture of it, and then you're going to submit the data online. And that's what the form looks like. I'll show you afterwards as well what the whole form looks like on the web page. So you'll put in things like your name, your address, when you went sampling, where you went sampling, and then they kind of have these boxes you can click with drop down menus where you report how much of each kind and color of microplastic you had. And if possible, you can also mail the University of Portsmouth your actual microplastic sample. And they go on and they do further analysis with it. Perhaps not economically feasible right now for most people since, you know, it's in the UK. But you could, if you wanted to, mail them your microplastic sample, and then they'll do further analysis on it, and it'll become a part of an even bigger study. So that's one way to sample for microplastics as a part of a community science project. The other way is through the Plastic Wave Project. So this is a nonprofit organization that was actually founded in New Jersey, and it's pretty New Jersey specific. I think they do allow people to submit from out of state, but you just have to like note that it's from a different state. But their overall goal with this project is they're trying to find microplastic hotspots in New Jersey. And so they partnered up with another organization called Safe Coastal Wildlife, and they work to educate the public about microplastics, and they manage this whole community science project with microplastics I'm going to tell you about. Some other things that they do are beach cleanups. They do really cool events in non-COVID circumstances, and they do a lot of public outreach and education. So you can also sign up to get emails from them, and they'll let you know when they're having events. But in terms of sampling, things you'll need, so I'll point out some differences between the methods as we go along here. So here, you don't need 1 jar, you need 9 jars. And that's because of the sampling technique. It's a bit more in depth. You'll also need some tape and some Sharpies, and that's for labeling the jars. You'll also need a square meter, so you could use the rope method, as mentioned before. You can actually just take a meter stick out. This is what I did when I went and I did it. Just, you know, you put out your meter stick and you use your foot and you trace a line in the sand, and then you just make the square and you just connect it all. Just make an outline with your foot in the sand. And then you'll also need a spoon or a shovel, and you'll also need a sifter. So one thing I really like about the Plastic Wave Project's protocol is they really encourage people to get creative to make this project accessible to everyone. So a lot of people will make sifters homemade. They can be made out of things like old window screens and wood, so you might have that lying around your house. Or again, you can use like a kitchen sifter. I got one from like the dollar store and it works just fine. So you can use that as well. And so for their project, you can go to Project Wave or plasticwaveproject.com/microplastics, and there you're going to find a volunteer sign-up form. You fill that out, and then they're going to send you an email. And in that email, they're going to invite you to their Google Classroom. And the Google Classroom is where you submit your data. So whereas with the other protocol, you would submit your data on this form, here it's submitted to a Google Classroom, and there's some other forms involved. So once you're signed up for the project, go ahead, get your supplies, pick a beach, and again, you're going to want to go out at a low tide kind of time. And they put out kind of guidelines for sampling seasons. So the spring sampling season is going to be from March 20th to April 4th. Then their summer sampling from June 19th to July 4th, and their fall sampling September 18th to October 3rd. So if you're interested in this project, you'll get notified on the Google Classroom and stuff when their sampling season is every year. So their winter sampling season recently passed, and that's when I went out and did mine. And I'll be going out and later this month to go do my spring microplastic sampling. So once you're at the beach, so whereas before you would just pay attention to the high tide line or the rack line, here you're actually going to sample at 3 different locations on the beach. You're going to sample at the low tide line, the high tide line, and the dune line. So the low tide line is going to be where basically the water is low, right? It's moved out. High tide line, you're going to see an accumulation further up the beach of debris and such. And then the dune line is going to be farther up the beach. And even if there's no dune, you would still sample up towards the edge of the beach at the what's called the dune line. And so you'll start from the low tide line and then move your way up. So basically you would go low tide line, go across, high tide line, go across, and then dune line and go across. And their sampling and subsampling procedure is a little bit different here. So you're going to set up your square meter on the beach at your low tide line, and you're going to take your spoon or your little shovel, and you're going to take 3 scoops and put it into your sifter, and you're going to sift it. You're just going to shake it, and you're going to do that outside of the 1 square meter box. You want to do that out so that anything that you are sifting doesn't end up back in your square and then you accidentally pick it up again. So you go in there, you take 3 scoops, you sift, then you take the collected microplastics and you put it into a labeled jar. We'll go over jar labeling in a couple slides. So scoop, sift, dump microplastic into jar. Then you're going to do that 2 more times within the same square. So whereas with the other protocol, you would have taken 5 scoops or 5 little random spots, here you're only doing 3. So it's a subsample of 3 for every square. And again, you want to take just the surface sand, like the top inch or so. So after you do that, you scoop, sift, dump, scoop, sift, dump, scoop, sift, dump. You have finished your first collection. So again, there's 9 jars because you're sampling 9 different locations. 3 at the low tide line, 3 at the high tide line, and 3 at the dune line. So whereas with the other procedure, you're just going high tide line, 5 and 5 across. Here you're doing 3 different locations. You're doing 3 spots at each location within, and then each one has 3 subsamples. So you want to be random with it too. So I made this picture. Hopefully this will make the procedure a little bit easier to follow. So you would find your dune line or your low tide line, and you would set up your first square, whether that's with a meter stick or rope. You'll take 3 random samples. Then you'll take 5 to 10 big steps, and then you'll set up your next one. And again, you'll take 3 random samples. And each one of these boxes is a separate sample. So this one would be low tide line number 1, low tide line number 2, low tide line number 3. And you just repeat the procedure moving up the beach. So then you'd go to your high tide line and you do the same exact thing, and then you'd go up to your dune line and do the same exact thing again. So you can see why you need to have labels. This is not a 1 jar kind of sampling procedure. This is a 9 jar sampling procedure. And so how to label them, what you'll do is you'll take some tape and you'll put it on your jar. And things you need to include on there, your beach location. So maybe you went to Island Beach State Park and you'd put Island Beach State Park and the beach you went to in there. Then you'll put the date, so whatever day you went out and you sampled. Then you'll put whether it was at the dune line, high tide or low tide line. And you'll put whether it's sample number 1, 2, or 3. You just want to be consistent in your labeling, and then you just put your initials on there. So that's how you would label each jar. So one thing you could do is you could plan out your sampling event, and you could label your jars before you even get there, or you could label as you go. So when it comes to sample analysis, a little bit simpler, I would say, than the other one. So instead of separating everything by microplastic type and color, you're actually just going to pick out the microplastics. And they don't have a particular size cutoff for this procedure. But again, you don't want to put something like a plastic bag in there. You want to make sure it's like a smaller plastic. And so what you'll do is you'll dump out your sample on like a piece of paper, or I did mine on like a cookie tray. So I just like had like a high edged cookie tray, and I dumped my sample in there. You can take like tweezers, or I like used a spoon, and you just kind of sort through it. And you want to pick out all the microplastics and put them off to the side. So what I did when I did this procedure was I went in and I picked out the microplastics, and since it's in a jar, I would just have the jar and then I put the lid in front of it, and any microplastics I found I would just put in the lid of that jar, so I knew like dune line number 1 had these microplastics in it, and I just sorted it like that. And so you might come across situations where you're like, oh, I don't know if this is a microplastic or not. There's 2 different ways that you can figure that out. You can do what's called the hot needle test, where you just take a needle and a lighter, you just like sit there, you like heat up the needle for a second, and then you poke the plastic, and if the plastic melts, then it's plastic. If it didn't melt, you put the hot needle to it and nothing happened, then that's not a microplastic. The other thing you can do, and I did this a lot during mine because I was like, I can't tell if this is like a rock or if this is like a nurdle. So you have a little cup of water next to you and you just drop the microplastic in there. If it's a microplastic, it's going to float to the top. If it's not a microplastic, it's going to sink to the bottom. And then what you'll do is you'll pick out all your microplastics, put it off to the side, and then you'll move on to the data submission section. So for the plastic wave project, there's 2 different kinds of forms. So you have the sampling data sheet form. You can get this on their website, and it's nicely labeled, so it's very easy to find. You can print this out and bring it with you to the beach, and you can fill it out there, or you can print it out and you can fill it out at home, or you can even just write your notes like in a notebook, and then you can fill out this form digitally using a PDF editor. Up to you how you want to do it, and whatever you're comfortable with. If it's too techy, you don't have to do it that way. You could just print it out and write it. So things you'll include on this, just your name, wherever you took your samples, the date. What's interesting about their study is that they have you include things like when did you go out and sample, like the time of day. They want to know things like the time of the low tide and the time of the next high tide and the phase of the moon. And while you're out there, you want to take some notes about the weather conditions. Was it sunny out? Was it rainy out? Was there recently a snowstorm? Things like that. And then you could also include some notes in there as well. So maybe you went to a beach and you did not see any sort of microplastic. You still want to write that down. You could put in your notes here, went out and sampled, and I did not find any microplastics. Still data, still important data that we want to record and submit.
I have a question.
Can you just hold your question till the end?
Sure.
Thank you. So the second kind of form is the sample submission sheet. So you can print this out from their website. What's important with this, because this is a ruler, you have to maintain the accuracy of it. So you have to print at 100% scale. Make sure you print it like that. You can just have one sheet that you use repeatedly, or you can print one out for every sample that had microplastics present. And so if you were going to use this with the way where you print one out for everyone that is positive for microplastics, you'd print it out. So maybe out of your 9 samples, 4 of them were positive for microplastics. Then you put your name, the date, time, beach, and then you would circle if it's the low tide line, high tide line, and dune line, and you would write the number. So maybe it was high tide line number 3. So you'd circle high tide line and write the number 3. And then you would place all of your different microplastics on this sheet. Usually what people do is they'll line them up along the length of the ruler. So maybe you found 4 pieces of microplastics, you could put them 1, 2, 3, 4. And so that's just to get an idea of how big those are. And then what you'll do is you'll take a picture. So you filled out your form, you put out your microplastics, you'll take a picture of that form, and you'll submit that picture to the Google Classroom along with your other form. Alternatively, what you could do is you could not fill out this bottom part, and you can just put your microplastics up here and take a picture, and you can put that picture onto your computer and save it as a PDF, and then you could digitally fill this in. So again, if this is a little too techy or complicated, you don't want to do that, you don't have to do that. So if you save it as a PDF, you can submit it that way. You could save it as a PDF and then submit it to the Google Classroom. So again, one of these for every sample that was positive. So if you had 5 positive sample jars, you would have 5 of these forms to submit along with the other form we looked at on the previous slide. That's it for sampling procedure and data submission. Just one thing I just want to remind everybody of is anytime you're going out to do any kind of field work, always make sure you have a field buddy. So it's cool if you want to do it with like a friend or you want to get your family involved. Always great to have more people working in these community science projects. And so with that, here is the winter reading points for Readsquared. The code is tiny. And so I will stop sharing this